Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending AI Business Week. I am pleased to welcome you to this session, Thriving in Uncertain and Turbulent Times, How E-commerce Market Leaders Are Taking AI to the Next Level. Thank you to our 2021 sponsors, Nuance and Atos. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. On the left-hand side of your screen is a Q&A. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can type your question into the Q&A box and submit your questions to our speakers. All questions will be saved, so if we don't get to answer you, we may follow up via email. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the yellow Help widget. Here you can find answers to common questions. A copy of today's slide decks are available for download in the green Resources widget, as well as other resources made available for download from our sponsors. Towards the end of today's presentation, please complete the survey that is already on your screen. It will only take 1 minute to complete, and your feedback is extremely helpful. Finally, an on-demand version of the webcast will be available about 1 day after the event and can access using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier today. I would now like to turn the event over to our moderator, Editor of Strategic Content on AI Business, Chuck Martin.
Thank you, Becky. Welcome back, and welcome to those just joining this session, the second session of today's AI Business Week Symposium. I'm Chuck Martin, Editor of Strategic Content for AI Business. I would like the speakers joining us today on the first day of the AI Business Week Digital Summit to briefly introduce themselves. Eden?
Yes, hello everybody. My name's Eden Zoller. I'm Chief Analyst with OMDIA, Consumer Services. I have a fairly broad beat, but the areas that I've really been doubling down on recently are AI impacts on consumer services and commerce. So a pretty good fit for this session.
Thank you. And Errol?
Hi everyone, my name is Errol Kolmester. I'm the product area lead engineer for H&M Group. That basically means I'm responsible for the technical development of our AI capabilities within the group.
Great. And from Nuance, Sebastian?
Hi everyone, my name is Sebastian Reeve. I'm Director of Strategy at Nuance Communications. We specialize in providing conversational AI to brands globally. So taking a slightly different perspective into the room in terms of how we can use conversation to change customer experience.
Great stuff. Well, our first session today was on AI and media, and now we're set to focus on AI and e-commerce retail. Tuesday, we will focus on AI in healthcare and AI in telco. Wednesday, AI in finance and AI in manufacturing. Thursday, AI in energy, AI in automotive, and on in addition to viewing the session most relevant to you, whatever you attend this week, I encourage you to attend sessions relating to industries outside of your own, since you're likely to hear of an AI best practice you can incorporate into your own organization. Now, let's get started with a current look at the market of AI in e-commerce and retail. I'll now turn this over to Eden at OMDIA. Eden?
Chuck, thanks very much, and welcome everybody to this session. Once again, my name's Eden Zoller, Chief Analyst with OMDIA for Consumer Services. What I'm going to do in my time is look at AI innovation and impact across the consumer path to purchase. I'm going to start by kind of looking at the big picture, thinking about where retailers are investing, what are their priorities, and also what consumers think about all this. I'm then going to drill down a little bit further and sort of break down the commerce journey and look at where and how AI is having an impact. What I want to do next is look specifically at voice commerce through AI assistants. It's certainly creating a lot of excitement, but also a lot of hype. And then finally, I'm going to sort of wrap up with some best practices, which are really going to be sort of ideas that I hope will spark areas for improvement and next steps. So let's get cracking. There's no doubt that AI has moved from the labs into commercial solutions that can deliver tangible business benefits, and that includes retail and e-commerce. Now, we've got a specialist AI team for verticals, and they've produced some very granular forecasts that I've shared here. And this is for retail of all types, so it's physical, it's online, and it's hybrid. And essentially, they've identified 24 major AI use cases that are going to drive investments in retail through to 2025. And as you can see here, the numbers are looking pretty good. They forecast that retailers of all kinds will invest 1.3 billion in AI software spend in 2019, ratcheting up to 9.8 billion by 2025. So that's pretty punchy. And the pie chart on the right, now that shows just the top 10, 11 use cases. And these use cases are going to pretty much drive the bulk of their AI software investment. Now, there's nothing like looking at things from the consumer perspective to provide a bit of a sanity check. And I think we'll all agree we really need that with AI. And what I've done here is share some findings from two core OMDIA surveys, one for AI and another one separate for COVID-19. And, you know, the good news is that consumers are seeing AI as a positive development. And in 2020, the survey showed that 46% of consumers saw AI in this way, an increase from 40% in 2019 and 34% in 2018. And this is very positive, but I think we have to agree that trust is an issue with AI from the consumer perspective, particularly when it comes to who consumers trust most to deliver secure, reliable AI services. And it's really not that high. Device manufacturers score best with 34% in the trust stakes. E-commerce players come in at 28%, and that's level with banks. Physical retailers lag at 19%, but they're not at the bottom. That's social networks at around 12%. So there's still a lot of work to be done when it comes to inspiring consumer trust in the reliability and security of AI services. I've also included a couple of findings from that sort of COVID-19 survey. And as I think we all know, you know, e-commerce is really booming during the pandemic, and our numbers confirm that. As you can see there, 53% of consumers can increase their online shopping for non-groceries. But what's more important still, I think, is that 48% of consumers expect to maintain this increased activity post-pandemic. And that really sort of piles on the pressure for e-commerce to be more efficient, more effective, which in turn, I think, magnifies the need for smart solutions. I'm now going to drill down a little bit further on how and where AI is shaping the consumer path to purchase. There can be a tendency, I think, when we talk about AI in the commerce context, to concentrate just on one or two things. It's often recommendations, and I kind of get that. You know, you think how successful Amazon has been with its recommendation engine, for example. But actually, AI touches pretty much every point on the path to purchase, from the start with customer intelligence right through to after-sales support. It's a joined-up journey. And it's a real mistake to think about AI in silos, because that really limits what it can do and how it can scale. So let's go a little bit further into how AI can impact pre-purchase touchpoints. You can see there's quite a lot of use cases here, and it's similar in the next couple of slides. So I'm not going to go through everything. I'm going to kind of jump in and out and just highlight a couple of things. And you know, I think the first thing to stress, and it can't be stressed enough, is that AI can kick in before a consumer has even started their purchase journey. Cue customer intelligence. And this is where AI, I think, is really making a huge difference. And you can see several examples there. You know, one I quite like to highlight is the way that machine learning can really improve propensity modeling. So this means predicting customer intent more accurately and at a deeper level. So let's quickly jump to discovery. And what we're seeing already is how AI search optimization tools are improving the results for complex queries. But I think there's going to be a really big shift when AI is used to power voice and visual search, and this will really transform the consumer experience. So looking at evaluation, I think a really interesting development there is how augmented reality applications can be used to provide context. So, for example, sort of virtual try before you buy experiences. And I think this really can help and remove some of the uncertainty that can often derail an online purchase. And I think, too, AR apps that allow consumers to find the best match item will really help reduce product return rates. So let's move on and look a little bit more about how AI can impact purchase touchpoints. Now, I think here there's often a tendency to focus just how AI can sort of improve the whole sort of payments, transaction processing element of the purchase touchpoints. And this is quite right, but it actually goes a lot broader. And the sort of area I want to highlight is cart management. There's some really good stuff happening with AI here. And I think, we can all agree that a poor returns experience can really cause sort of reputational damage, and it can actually deter people from shopping with a particular brand going forward. And, AI can help here. It can help actually mitigate cart abandonment. So, for example, machine learning algorithms can analyse various data sets associated with the checkout process and determine, the reasons for rejection and suggest ways to address this. Data privacy, I mean, I've sort of captured it here, but in reality it sort of spans pretty much every part of the consumer commerce journey. And it's interesting really because AI poses challenges for data privacy, but it can also be a force for good, and I've summarised some of the reasons there. So, for example, AI tools that can remember a person's privacy preferences and settings and make them consistent across an organisation's services and channels. I think that can be quite powerful. And then the final part of the purchase journey is post-purchase touchpoints, and AI can have some pretty good impacts here. And the areas I'm just going to touch on here is the role that AI can play in the returns context and also autonomous vehicles in the context of delivery. So let's again sort of look at returns, and I've just mentioned how AI can help streamline the process and actually sort of help automate returns and authorizations, and I think that's pretty compelling. Analytics can really make sort of loyalty programs far more effective by segmentation, by looking at sort of the type of rewards and offers that are going to really sort of feed into what loyal customers are looking for. There's been a lot of excitement around the role that sort of fully driverless vehicles can play in deliveries. And indeed, it will happen, and a lot of firms are already experimenting in this area. But the reality is a little bit different. We're not going to see fully autonomous driverless vehicles for at least 5 years, probably more. And, what we're really looking at in the interim is semi-autonomous delivery vehicles, where only certain functions are driverless and where other elements are still in the control of humans. Now, I want to look a little bit more closely at voice commerce via AI assistants. I'm thinking of the mass market AI assistants here. And I think it's an area that understandably is creating a lot of excitement, as I said earlier. But as with a lot of AI, it's also creating a fair amount of hype. There's no doubt that consumers own more types of AI device than they ever have before. Now, smartphones are the main sort of consumer AI device today, and it's one of the reasons that we actually excluded them from the survey. So outside of smartphones, what are we looking at? Well, smart speakers like the Amazon Echo are proving pretty popular, and actually our sort of separate forecast show that sort of units of sales and installed base are climbing quite quickly. Next to that, it's smart wearable devices, so think of things like the Apple Watch, and then voice-enabled TV devices, so smart TVs, remote controls with AI capabilities. And typically, where consumers go, retailers follow. Now, in the context of smart devices, as you can see from that chart on the right, 11% of retailers are saying that they already use smart devices as a sales channel. It might seem like a low figure, but actually I think that's pretty impressive because quite frankly, sort of commerce sales via smart devices is still pretty new. But what about active usage? How often are people using commerce applications via voice assistants? The short answer is that they're using them more, as you can see from the findings here. Applications for bookings, for buying products and services, and actually for interacting with advertising and promotions. So usage factors, once a day, several times a week, it's all increasing. At the same time, the number of people that say they never use these applications or very rarely is going down. So that's very positive. You might notice actually that the sort of highest frequency bracket at several times a day, that's actually dipped slightly in 2020. I don't think it's that surprising. I think, what you saw, earlier is more people sort of experimenting, trying out this stuff. Whereas I think that sort of frequency of experimentation, if you like, is actually starting to dip down a bit. So I think that's why the highest usage bracket there has slightly dipped. But there's still quite a lot of work to be done. Voice commerce via AI assistants is getting better, but it's not perfect. And I've zoned in here on voice payments because I think it's probably the toughest nut to crack. Now, the main reasons that consumers don't make voice payments via AI assistants is because they prefer to buy products the old-fashioned way, the way they've always done so. Not a complete surprise. And it really does underscore, I think, one of the biggest challenges to any radically new payment method, changing ingrained user behaviour. And there's no doubt about it, the voice payments are a radical change in behaviour, a radically different way to make payments. The second biggest deterrent is people don't feel comfortable making voice payments. And I think, again, that sort of hooks back round to why they're defaulting to existing methods. Trust is a big issue and on multiple fronts. So low trust in how AI assistants handle data privacy and security in the voice payments context. Low trust in the ability of AI assistants to get voice commands right, which could end up with the wrong thing being bought, which is fairly disastrous. But I think to sort of wrap up this on a positive note, what's really noticeable that all these barriers are abating, they're getting lower, and I'm really hoping that with our 2021 surveys, they'll come down still further. So that's a really positive takeout. What I want to do to wrap up is just leave you with some sort of best practices, some sort of recommendations or ideas on what we need to keep in mind and what we can do to sort of make things better. Be joined up. We've seen in this presentation how every part of the commerce journey is joined and how AI can have an impact on every part of the consumer path to purchase. And to make AI have maximum impact, you need to implement it in the same joined up way. As I said right at the start, confining AI to silos, directing it to one function, that sort of point solutions, is really going to limit what AI can achieve and how it can scale. Customer intelligence, build the foundation. I really think in customer needs, intents, and behaviours are the bedrock on which commerce is built. You know, the greater the understanding, the better the commerce journey will be in terms of the user experience and commercial outcomes. Look to AI for advanced analytics, data management, enhanced segmentation tools, propensity modelling, among other things. New and emerging technologies, really keep your eye on this. You know, I know that AI can be daunting, particularly when it comes to the newer developments and technologies, which obviously pose a higher investment risk. But I think by really sort of keeping on top of this, keeping that watch and brief, will allow you to move quickly when the time is right. And things to look out for here, I think, include voice and visual search, voice payments, the kind of role that AI can play in customer care and CRM, and also AR applications, and that's just the short list. And then finally, really do get in front of data privacy. You know, AI can extract and analyse data like never before. And when applied to sort of sensitive transactional data, this really increases concerns around data privacy. So I think we really need to get in front of this. And also, you know, strong privacy credentials will win consumer trust. And at the end of the day, trust in AI, in commerce, is what it's all about. And that wraps up my section of the presentation. So Chuck, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and what a great kickoff for this session. Good stuff. Thank you. Now we're going to hear from some seriously leading-edge AI going on at H&M. So I'm going to turn this over to Errol. Errol?
Thank you so much, Chuck, and thank you, Eden, for a very interesting presentation. I will not be talking so much about use cases and the actual applications. I will talk quite a lot about pushing AI to the next level. Which of course then requires us to go through our history a little bit on what we have done so far. But first, let me reintroduce myself. Errol Kohlmeister. I'm the product area lead engineer for AI Foundation. As you can see, our very nice logo there. We like branding in H&M, so we are no less in the AI Foundation over here. Our journey with AI at group level really started around 2016, where something started happening in the market. As you know, H&M has a physical retail store model and has so successfully over the last 70 years. But we also started to see it was hard to expand more. We could, of course, become more relevant and start expanding in other areas, which we have done. But around 2016, it became apparent that we needed to do something more than we were doing today. So our CEO at the time, Carl Johan, came down to business development and asked, what are we doing with AI? Business development, of course, started looking around in the organization, mapping the different initiatives. But in the end, we came up with that it wasn't so much we were doing at scale. And you have to remember the scale that H&M operates at. Then we started looking into, okay, so what can we do then? What can we do then? So we decided that we would look into some high value and feasible type of use cases. And we started initiating them. So we, of course, then went with external capabilities. We went to an external consultancy firm. We didn't really have that type of people we needed to run these use cases at scale. It was so successful so that in 2018, we actually set up the first new function in H&M for the last 10 years. Being a new function, of course, allowed us to have our own budget, our own investments, and started to really focus on these type of things. So we started building up the AI capabilities so that we in 2019 really could take the lead on what we were doing. But then, of course, last year, all of you know what happened. In the middle of our great plans, COVID came, and we thought we needed to really push forward with everything that we saw. We saw a great opportunity and a necessity to evolve. What we realized is that we believe that no major fashion player has yet taken the position as a leader within AI. So we saw this as a great opportunity to actually evolve our capabilities and start focusing on what we wanted to do. So we then established a new vision. We wanted to make H&M Group the industry leader in applied AI with scalable and integrated solutions covering the entire value chain. A key mark for us has really been to focus on the value and the scale and making sure that we don't just do things in the lab, we actually take them into production and see the value of them. So with that new vision, we also started analyzing, so what do we need to take AI to the next level? To take AI to the next level, we realized that the use cases we've had so far, they had proven value. We had 7 or 8 large scale rolled out across the world. But we couldn't hire more than the 100 people we already hired the last 2 years. If we were to do that alongside all the use cases that you saw, for instance, Eden present in a few slides ago, then we would need to hire thousands of people. And there weren't just enough people for us to scale at the level we wanted to. So we set up a few targets for ourselves. We wanted to make AI available across H&M Group. We wanted to be more of a facilitator when it comes to scalability and specialization of these things. So for us, it was really about creating foundational teams to facilitate the scaling of AI capabilities. So rather than going on use case by use case, we focus on training and development, portfolio prioritization and management of our use cases, exploration and research, ecosystem and vendor management, data science dev tools and infrastructure to make sure that all of the things we were building really came and were available for all. We also wanted to focus on expertise and guilds, risk and ethics, quality assurance, AI-specific ways of working, knowledge capture, and management. Setting this strategy for us really was all about then, okay, so how do we continue now? So in order for us to actually take all of these different capabilities and push them out to the organization, we needed a clear strategy and a clear need of communicating these things. That's why we created the Fountainhead. It's our project of democratizing AI in H&M, going from scattered set of capabilities, from different use cases, gathering the best practices together in the organization. So the Fountainhead for us has a purpose of democratization of AI. It has the purpose of reducing time to market for AI use case development, making AI tools accessible for all in order to enable usage and unlock the value of AI. It wants to contribute to a higher AI skill set in business tech, which is our organization, through AI literacy and hands-on support, and also increase the model output availability for all. For instance, demand forecasting. Why do it in a one-to-one relationship when you can do it in a one-to-many? Why reinvent the wheel over and over again? So the set of capability from a technical standpoint that we identified lies heavily on a data foundation. Of course, in order for us to explore and see the things that we want to do, we need to have a stable data foundation that makes data accessible for all in both a privacy protected type of way, but also in a federated way, so product teams can work independent with the data. We want to create technical capabilities, not just the end user capabilities around good recommendation engines, for instance, but how do we do a recommendation engine that is scalable and that we can learn from and we can do over and over again. So how do we develop new models from an AI capability? How do we take these models and put them into production? How do we create common standards and infrastructure? How do we increase the AI literacy? How do we create reusable output, visualization, documentation, control towers and measurements, proof of concept development and support, so that we can easily incubate AI use cases into AI Foundation, create the same capability for multiple processes and same output for multiple analysis, so that our users, the product teams, the tech users, the business users, and the different enabling teams we have in H&M can go out and deliver value to our customers and partners across the world. So taking AI to the next level for us, it's not just about doing use cases. It's about making sure we can do hundreds, if not thousands of use cases across the group, across the world. That's how we're going to take AI to the next level. That's how we believe we're going to accelerate the use of data and AI to create great value for our customers. So what we see here is that we're going to give people access to technical AI tools for use case development, hands-on idea articulation support when identifying new AI use cases, AI development support for product teams when starting to develop new AI use cases, and also make sure that they have access to training, online courses, documentation, templates, and best practices. So we're going to create a large range of technical and non-technical resources available for the product teams in H&M. So how do we exemplify this then? Well, imagine you have an ML engineer, which is a technical part. It's the counterpart of the data scientist that needs tools that reduces the time it takes to scale industrialized AI use cases. Well, then the Fountainhead platform going to include accessible and reusable tools to use when developing and scaling AI use cases, spending less time on reinventing the wheel, taking development time from 12 months approximately down to 6 months. Or if you're a product owner and you want to know how you can apply AI in your daily work and get hands-on help when developing new AI use cases, well, then the product teams can get access to training materials, documentation, templates, as well as getting hands-on support in idea articulation, proof of concept development, and efforts from our AI exploration team, and easy-to-use AI tools. Or if you're more on the front line working as a merchandiser and you want to have easy access to the latest sales forecast in your stores and regions, well, then the Fountainhead is going to enable you to reuse model output that somebody else has already created, getting you access to the data so you can create true value. So in the end, what this basically means is that we're going to take AI to the next level by having today long time to industrialize use cases into 50% shorter time to markets. And that's going to make a major impact into the AI use cases we can deliver to the organization. We're going to have going from AI tools and technology being constrained by mainly being towards tech people today into unlocking use case value potentially across the entire value chain with easier tool sets. Today, having fragmented AI landscape driving low level of reusability to tools validated and made available on a single place with a common infrastructure. And then going from a lack of AI community today into a fostering of co-creation and a sharing culture. And this is going to be a key component in enabling the talent that's going to join H&M in the future. And that's how we're going to take AI to the next level at H&M. Thank you. Over to you, Chuck.
Wow, you are very busy at H&M. This is great stuff. I'm looking forward to the discussion on this at the end of this program. Everyone, there's a Q&A button on the console. Please feel free to ask your questions. We will address them at the end of the session. Thank you very much, Errol. That was fantastic, to understate the case. Now I'm going to turn this over to Nuance. Sebastian?
Hello again, everyone. I'm Seb Reeve. I'm Director of Strategy at Nuance Communications. That was a great presentation to follow. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion very much. I wanted to shift gears a little bit and just sort of really talk about some very explicit use cases and trying to understand and share with you what we can learn from that. But just a quick reintroduction to Nuance. We're really all about conversation and ensuring we drive down friction and ensure consumers can really navigate the customer journey with brands worldwide. And we believe success is achieved when three key imperatives prevail. So those really being automation. Just really recognizing that automation these days is a necessity. It's the gateway to effortless self-service, for consumers and for agents, but also a better bottom line and driving costs out of the system, particularly in the last year in terms of everything that's happened. Most of the brands we're serving these days have seen huge increases in volume. And obviously this has happened in challenged times in terms of resource availability. So automation's really become key to brands to really maintain a high level of service to the consumers that they serve. The second of which is connected experiences. So looking at the consumers today have a huge number of channel choices and just really helping them to navigate, provide choice to them, but help them navigate the different choices that they might make so they can actually get to an end result, an outcome in the quickest, most easy possible way. No one wants to waste time repeating themselves as they're moving between different touch points with your brand. But with all of the automation being necessary, we still do believe that the human touch still matters. And there's a balancing act here because, customers really do in many instances need the human contact in terms of being able to reach out to someone to get advice or a deeper connection. And that certainly talks to elements of trust, etc., as well, and helping to kind of foster or engender that trust with end consumers. Which brings me to the last point, and just sort of moving back to the point Eden was making earlier on, which I think is incredibly important also. Trust, with any of these kinds of capabilities or new solutions being introduced into customer experience, trust is essential. After all AI technologies are really using large volumes of consumer data to try and train models and create differentiated experiences for your brand. So being allowed to use that data and using that data responsibly is really key to getting into really a feedback loop of usability. So users actually want to use these solutions because they feel that this trust is there, and therefore they'll use them more. And obviously that's beneficial to you as a brand, because you then get more data to improve those solutions with. So it's really a reciprocal arrangement that's really based around trust. And so I'll get onto some examples, which I think really would be hopefully a little bit thought-provoking for you. And actually, the first of which I chose, which follows quite neatly on from Errol's presentation. So H&M, I think have done an amazing job in the last couple of years. So just getting above the idea of delivering chatbots and messaging to users, which they've done admirably across their web estate. But the use case I wanted to tease out really is on the theme of starting to bring in-store and digital closer together. So really just thinking about some of the capabilities and some of the things that you do in store naturally, which actually digital interfaces have never really been that good at. And I think Eden touched on it as well. So one of the things H&M did, which I absolutely love, is within the virtual assistant on the website, they brought in a conversational capability where you can also upload an image, for example. So in this case, I uploaded an image of a pair of shoes I found on some other website, some other fashion brand. And essentially it does an image search, it finds comparable products within the H&M portfolio, which is fantastic, but also it takes it a step further than that. It lets you then conversationally refine that search, right? Start to drill down. And what I really find interesting about this is it's starting to get from chatbots answering questions, FAQ kind of questions, and getting into the area of offering advice, so it helps you to discover products or services that might be really tailored to you. So I think that's a really great example of bringing that sort of store capability into the digital channel. Just extending on that again, H&M, they've taken the investments they've made, but they've also thought about, further into the bricks and mortar, right, into the location-based search. So just thinking about how you get access to users before they might come and visit the store. So here they're partnering also with Google. And so within the Google Maps application, if you search on any of the stores for H&M in the US currently, it actually offers you a capability to message with H&M. You'll talk to the chatbot there, getting all of the reused capabilities from the channels they've already launched with this in it. But also, again, you can escalate this to a human advisor over a messaging channel. So they're really bringing discovery into the mix here. So how do you discover a new means of accessing information about a product or service, check stock availability, all of the things you might want to do before you waste your time visiting a branch that may not have what you need, for example. So I think that's a really great way of just bringing AI into the user behavior that already exists. People are already using maps search at scale to find locations. So let's put the experience where the users are. So that's really interesting. And just sort of getting out of, I think the advice given at the start of the webinar is also to look at different segments and what other industries are doing with this kind of technology. So here's an example from a bank, and you might think, well, what does banking have to do with retail or e-commerce here? But I think what's been really interesting, sort of looking cross industry, is lots of us are trying to figure out how to deal with remote. So, customers actually getting really human-to-human interaction over remote channels using, media like this, like video and video calling online, for example. Now, in banking, of course, that's incredibly important because the complexity of the services requires quite a high touch. But again, just getting back to that trust subject, the topic of trust is really key. And obviously, in banking, it's regulatory mandated. Trust and security are very important in banking, but no less really in most other industries in terms of knowing who your customer is and making sure you're using their data for them. So what the IBC in Korea are doing, which I think is really unique, is they're using AI to analyze the voice of the customer during video calls continually and assert the identity of that customer on a continual basis. So this is really a security and anti-fraud capability. So as we're opening up these new channels, of course, there's a danger we start to open up risk. And back to Eden's presentation in terms of IoT devices, those sort of voice commerce devices, but really making sure that we have comparable or even better security protocols in place when we start to open up these channels is really critical. Otherwise, we lose the user. They don't trust it, so they won't use it, and you'll never really get the benefit from deploying this kind of solution in the first place. So I think that's also a really good use case to really take the principles out of across every industry. And just sort of thinking about, again, another industry, Telefónica Móviles in Spain, obviously a telecoms carrier, they have about 1,000 stores across the Spanish market alone, let alone their South American operation. And during the COVID, actually, one of the things they really wanted to ensure is they were seeing huge amounts of demand spikes within their business for the traditional channels, for especially escalation channels like telephony. And so what they really wanted to do is ensure that they were giving preferential and personalized treatment to people who are at risk from the pandemic. So they worked with us to put in a technology that actually analyzes voice patterns again. And it's based on the same voice biometric authentication technology that we already have, but does age detection. So it starts to figure out if a person is in a segment that might be at risk, i.e. they're a little older, and it starts to offer them prioritization or preferential treatment. And it does that to minimize the likelihood of someone in that segment giving up in a very long call queue because of the additional traffic and visiting the store and putting themselves at risk. So clearly it's a really well thought through, but I think what we take into retail here is just the idea that we can use AI to start to analyze consumer behavior in terms of how they're interfacing with your business and use that for segmentation in ways that we haven't really explored fully yet. So in this case, it's age, but there are many other ways to sort of really analyze voice traffic or even typing style or the way someone uses your digital behaviorally, your digital interface to start to make assertions about them for personalization and behavioral analysis. So another really interesting use case. And just to sort of push things out there a little bit more and sort of look, a little bit more outside the box, but again on the theme of bringing together bricks and mortar and physical experiences that we're used to, right? The visitation experience, but then bringing the digital really firmly into that experience. Healthcare has really pushed things forward. So we're using AI here in a much more ambient way. So what you see here in the image, it's the box on the wall you need to look at. So we at Nuance partnered with Microsoft to create a Dragon ambient experience solution. So a physician who's treating a patient in the room can actually have an assistant on tap, which is not only helping the doctor by transcribing, analyzing, and structuring the notes from the encounter, right? Creating structured information that saves the doctor's time after the visit so they can move on to the next patient, but also offers a way for the doctor to actually ask questions, get information, and ensure that they're up to the minute in terms of not having to look at the screen or the patient's notes, and instead spend more time on the human-to-human encounter. And that's already been expanded into virtual channels like Teams. So thinking about how you take this, in their case, into telehealth, we're already doing this kind of ambient experience where in a Teams consultation, there is an ambient AI behind the scenes that's also making meaningful information, but it's also on tap for questioning as an assistant in that live encounter. And we think really when we move into other bricks and mortar industries like retail banking, we're going to start to see these kinds of technologies, which are already working in these industries, become useful. It may not be a box on the wall, but it certainly might, take a form of a tablet or another device that you could take onto the shop floor. So just really wanted to bring these kinds of use cases out so just to stimulate the discussion for the panel. So just to reiterate Eden's great introduction at the beginning of the talk and the session today, AI is already delivering value at many points in the customer journey. So all the way through from discover, all the way through to purchase and post-purchase, we're seeing real value being created by these solutions. And where I think things are really starting to take shape now is starting to knit these experiences together more into something that's more homogeneous, right? So this idea of an omni-channel experience where users get more consistency no matter which touch point they might choose to interact on, but consistent guidance and personalization and an awareness of them as an individual through the journey. So it's really exciting times, I think, for these technologies in the retail industry. So that's all for me. Back over to you, Chuck. Thanks.
Thank you. That was terrific. All three of these are just fabulous. Now we're going to start our panel discussion. So I'm going to bring Eden back in. You there, Eden?
Yeah, I'm here and ready.
Okay, and Errol?
I'm here and ready as well.
And Sebastian, thank you.
I'm here.
Okay. Eden, I wonder if you could start. You mentioned research about what consumers and perception of AI. What do consumers perceive AI to be? Do they know?
Yeah, that's a great sort of question, Chuck. We do ask a question about sort of, how much consumers understand AI, whether they see it as positive or negative. And I don't know if you remember that slide I shared. It does show that more and more consumers do see AI in a positive way, which is great because, these are some of the early adopters for AI applications and services. What I didn't share was there's still a huge number of consumers that are sitting on the fence. They don't know if AI is a good or bad thing, while other consumers are just plain scared about it. And actually, these consumers need more attention than those that are confident. You need to instill confidence and make these consumers that are frightened of AI or are still making up their mind, you want them to embrace it. I think the other thing that's worth keeping in mind, I think all of us here are very sort of staunch believers about the positive effects AI can have on commerce. But I still think there's loads of stuff we need to address. Other things that have surfaced through our survey work is that when it comes to voice payments, voice commerce, consumers are still struggling with making themselves understood. So although we've got these great, advances in voice recognition, in natural language processing, there's still a lot that needs to get better. And just one more point there. We've talked between us quite a lot about how AI can improve customer care, be it through a sort of, chatbot or a virtual assistant. And I think that's very true. However, a lot of these things are quite poorly executed. I think everybody's probably been on the receiving end of a poor chatbot or virtual assistant. And actually, it sort of backfires. It makes the situation even worse instead of better. So I think execution around AI and customer care needs to be so much better than it is.
Well said. I wonder, Errol, if you could comment on that in terms of your customer, your end customer. As Sebastian mentioned, you've got people dealing with your chatbots and interacting and so forth, but they're not necessarily saying, "Oh, this is AI. The H&M's AI. That's really good," right?
Yeah, defining AI is quite hard. Usually at H&M we talk about AI as amplified intelligence. When we actually identify what type of AI is it that we want to do, you have the operational supply chain pricing type of things, which are usually quite hidden from the customer experience. They're in the background. They improve our supply chain. We make sure the prices are correct and everything. And then you have the one you as a customer is going to engage with. And it's the perception of the ones that you engage with, which are important from a customer perspective. So when we talk about amplified in H&M, that's where we kind of take that and we actually amplify the humans working. What we want AI to work on is the long tails problem, right? We don't want them to work on everything. We want them to enhance the very smart people that we have, and hopefully we can get an experience which is part man, part AI, to make sure that there's always the man in the loop, that they're relevant and right conversations, and that you actually in the end can talk to a human if you don't getting the attention that you need.
Thank you. I wonder, Sebastian, if you could talk about some of this consumer interaction in terms of basically voice AI, because you guys have been doing that for a very long time. Is it that the technology is there, but then when a company starts to put it together, they don't put the correct AI back end or enough work into it? So, I mean, everyone's had a bad experience with voice chats.
I think I mean, Eden's point here is actually extremely well made. You know, if we look at the history, and again, we have been, you know, deploying and creating technologies and deploying them in businesses for 25 or so years, right? So I think what we've learned are a few things. And, you know, as these technologies are being democratized, they're readily available very, very cheaply, if not for free, right? So anyone can get a speech engine online these days. It's very much changed. What hasn't changed is the availability of design skills and the data processing wherewithal to actually train the models, you know, as necessary, and design experiences based on a real understanding of what users are trying to do and their behavior. That is still incredibly difficult, right? For most organizations, that is the challenge. And I think when I look across, you know, a lot of the interactions that we have in the market today, everyone focuses on the technology and spends a lot less time figuring out why is it I want it to do something and how am I actually going to design that, right? And how am I going to get that live in my business in a enterprise grade fashion, right? Because launching a chatbot for a few users internally as a proof of concept is incredibly easy. It's you know, it's a bit like you know, that old wartime motto, you know, no plan survives contact with the enemy. Well, no chatbot survives contact with the customer, right? The second you get real customers using it, that's when you start really learning, you know, what you need to do and how it needs to work. And you need very robust processes of measurement and feedback and redesign in a really agile way to actually really refine these and get to good, right? And I think that's usually where people fail. They launch expecting it's going to be perfect based on an idea they have in their heads, and it doesn't survive contact with the customer.
So do they then have to go back to the well and say, hey, we need to reinvent this yet again? And management says, wait a minute, we just gave you all this money first time around?
Well, AI is a constant investment, I think, and that's exactly what I loved Errol's presentation in terms of what they're trying to do at H&M. It's really to create a framework that actually takes that into account, right? The fact that your business needs to be good at this. It needs to be something you actively do and manage, not something you do once and leave, right? And I think every single poor voice experience I've seen, you know, was designed 8 years ago and no one's touched it since. And of course, you know, your products have changed, your customers have changed, their expectations of, you know, how they're going to contact you and why all are different. And then suddenly it doesn't work so well anymore, right? The technology is working exactly the same way it did 8 years ago. Unfortunately, your designs are no longer valid is usually the problem, right? So I think this is exactly the right you know, area for brands to focus on. Great point. Errol, I wonder if you can talk about, you have serious buy-in of AI at H&M. Did that come from the top down? What was the cause of this? Basically, it's a massive restructuring.
I would say we do have strong top-down support, but it also comes from being able to make a bet in the beginning and focus on the value that actually comes out of it. Making sure you have incremental value delivery and focus on getting the value and then taking those and reinvesting that into the business. Making sure it's not a 5-year project that's going to deliver value in the end, but rather 6 months, and then you build on that value. So we've been able to prove value quite significantly the first 2 years of the organization and continue delivering and scaling. And now we're at the stage where we see if we don't do this at the scale of H&M, we're going to miss out on a lot of value.
So do you have to deliver short-term results through this, proof of concept and so forth?
Yeah, I would say in order for us to take the approach of use case, then we needed to prove short-term results quite immediately. The presentation I have now is more, okay, so how do we enable this at scale? Which is how do we focus on a long-term perspective, creating the capabilities so we can be very good at this, but at the same time bundling it with a proof of value. We're doing this now, so we're building these platform capabilities based on use cases. So we're going to launch demand forecasting at scale, and we're going to launch personalization at scale, which is a set of multiple use cases and products being launched together with the platform. So we don't just build and then develop, we co-develop with the use cases as well.
And how do you get the word out internally? Because you're a large organization, and your group, I presume, is not 5,000 people. How do people in the organization find out that there are new AI capabilities, if you will?
Well, we have established dedicated product teams to actually handle the rollout of these type of capabilities. But in the end, it's three things: communication, communication, and communication. So that's what we do quite a lot. We focus on just creating good content, rolling it out, making sure we train the people as well. So this is about constant development, making sure this is not point efforts. These are ongoing, consistent efforts in training the personnel we have at H&M how to use AI.
Great. Eden, I wonder if you can talk about some of the AI user experiences that still need some work. We talked about the bad experiences with chatbots. Are other areas?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to flip it round a little bit, I think from a sort of a retailer, an organisational perspective, just to pick up on one thing that Errol touched on, but I think is really important. Errol, you sort of mentioned the importance of development tools, training, all these really sort of important sort of attributes. But I think from a company perspective, you know, how you're able to implement AI, particularly if you're a service provider, be it a telco, a bank, or a retailer, it kind of is make or break, depending on the quality of the data assets that you have access to. So I'm sort of flipping around your question a little bit, Chuck, because we've sort of touched on a lot of the issues from the consumer perspective. But I just wanted to elaborate that point, building on you know, some of the pointers that Errol outlined in his presentation. So I think, you know, the quality of the data assets that an organisation has access to, that it can leverage to train AI. I think other issues in terms, and this feeds right through to the user experience. You know, chatbots, virtual assistants that are voice enabled, we've touched on why some of those are quite bad due to sort of fairly cranky voice recognition and natural language processing. They need to work with nuance. But I think other factors that, you know, make sort of chatbots and virtual customer care assistants fall down is because actually they're very poorly integrated into the back end. So, example, they have quite poor integration with a retailer's product catalogue. So when it comes to sort of picking up on recommendations or what product you should buy next, they can't do that very effectively. In a similar way, there's poor integration with existing sort of customer insights and data, and that really blunts what an AI assistant, chatbot, virtual support agent can do. So that was jumping around a bit, but those are sort of some of the issues at the back end for the retailer, and you know, some that actually feed right through to the consumer.
So should a retailer still launch even though they know it's not perfect and just you know, improve as they go, or should they wait and do it right?
I'd be quite cautious, particularly if it's a customer care chatbot or virtual assistant, because actually these are quite high-profile things. You know, and if they're supporting a customer in a situation where that customer is not very happy, if that chatbot or virtual assistant can't stand up to the task, that's actually going to make things worse rather than better. You know, for example, you know, if somebody's unhappy about the product, they've had a problem with the return or the refund, they go to a voice interface virtual assistant to try and address the problem. That virtual assistant can't do it. The customer ends up even more frustrated, and hence the reputational damage. They ain't going to shop with that retailer again. So I think that's something to keep in mind too, that, you know, if you're going to do this stuff, do it properly with those customer-facing aspects and propositions of AI.
Is that what you found, Seb? Same thing, that people should wait or do it right, or what do you advise?
Well, I couldn't agree more. I think it's important, as Eden said, that the escalation journey is well managed. But I think the key word I picked out of your question here is wait until perfect. Well, if you can show me a human being in customer service is perfect, I definitely don't know of any artificial intelligence that's perfect, right? But people aren't either. So waiting for perfect's a very long wait in this world. I think we have to be pragmatic. So the question is how good is good enough to launch, right? So the question is really, can we get it live? Is it going to meet the majority of demand? And can we rapidly improve it in the long tail, as Errol pointed out, right? So the things we're getting less of, we probably haven't trained for, and do that rapidly. So we're dealing with the demand that is. Because in the end, we're not designing the kind of use cases that we want as organizations. We're actually really looking at what customers ask. Right? This is a reactive business. It's data-driven. You're essentially, and you have a pretty good idea of what the high running demand is on your business, of course. But as you get further down the demand tail, data is everything, because you start to see, well, what is next? What is high running? What can we deal with? What can a robot really never deal with? And we should just get a person involved immediately without, trying anything else. There's a real art to deciding, but that is a very agile process. And I think that's the sort of design, redesign and agile process I was talking about earlier on, that most businesses get wrong and usually is one source of failure. It's really not getting that process grounded within the business. There's an ongoing effort that's day in, day out, right? So there should be teams in the business that do this for a living.
Do most businesses know how hard this stuff is? Oh, go ahead, Eden.
Sorry, I almost forgot that, Seb, you sort of made me remember. This might sound obvious, but oddly enough, it's often overlooked. Stress test things before you launch them properly. And also in the context of chatbots and virtual assistants, make sure they're trained to know when is the time to hand over to a human agent, and make sure that handover is seamless. Again, these sound obvious things, which is probably why I forgot them, but they're really, really important.
Well, quite often, I think that's a great point, Ian. I think quite often the underlying business goals have an influence on the design that's arrived at. So a lot of the early, telephone experiences that people have had with, voice-driven IVR and these kinds of things in customer service, if you look behind the scenes of part of what failed, quite a lot of the time, the major focus of the project team was on cost reduction. And if you really only focus on cost reduction, you end up with designs that are really not about the customer at all, right? They're about saving you money, and that's it. So that's a really poor balancing act. So I think where we see and certainly advise for success is ensuring that you're thinking about what the customer's goal is first. And you will earn cost reduction inherently if that's your desire. But if you over-rotate on that, you just tend to design things that are quite poor in nature for customers. So I think that's, it's business goals and how you sort of drive the business goal is really important.
Errol, you want to weigh in on this?
Okay, Chuck. So from my point of view, of course, chatbots and these very visible, and which is very crucial as well for good interactions. But I would also argue we don't know what we don't know. So if you design perfect or you design up to a level and then you launch it, you have spent a lot of time developing things that you think. So for us, it's more important at some stage to run experiments, and run hundreds of experiments, if not thousands of experiments daily in all of our interactions with all of our customers. That's our target, at least, because we don't know everything. Not even the customers would know if we would ask them. But we want to design experience which are tailored to our customers so we can adopt the needs. So for us, it's more important to create a flexible infrastructure to be able to run these things, because we're going to explore so many things in the next few years. So we just don't want to wait until the end. The customer has to interact with the things we create so we can actually take decisions. Should we go ahead or should we just remove it? Do small sampling and then try to do the best with our statistical knowledge as well.
Totally agree. I think sorry, Chuck, over to you.
No, go ahead.
So a meaningful part of our business is also things like targeting. So, using predictive models and behavioral models on digital channels, for example, to push experiences to consumers before they ask. And that's, a huge world of A/B testing. So a lot of hypothesis, a lot of A/B testing to get feedback and ensure that you kind of figure out champion challenger, which hypotheses work. And of course, then there's a business measurement that you're tied into at the end. So trying to drive up revenue from the encounter by being proactive with customers, for example. So no one knows what the rules are. You're trying to create an environment where you're learning based on experience and data. So that's really what, leading organizations are getting results that way.
Has the pandemic changed in the last year or so? Has it changed AI in retail so that things could advance or not advance? Because a lot of markets and industries we've seen that because of the pandemic, they've actually accelerated some things that they couldn't have otherwise. Errol?
Who's the question to?
No, it's to all of you. Who wants to start?
I can start. I can start with some, real life examples from H&M. When the pandemic hit, everything was turned over. All of our forecasting models were wrong. So what was required from us was flexibility. So the focus on AI, even though we're fast fashion, we still have a long, I think 8 months approximately, supply chain to cater for. So we can't just change things. But what we need to do is flexibility. We need to reorganize things that actually makes it easier for us to be more agile in everything that we do. So I think what the pandemic really has accelerated from our part of view is, digitalization, because of course, online has gone up quite significantly. We strive more revenue from our online business and our digital channels, but also the agility, start new use cases, reprioritize existing use cases and shut things down, which might not deliver value immediately. All of these actions together, not just in AI, has made it possible for us to actually survive as a company in these troubling times. So I would say flexibility, digitalization, and change of focus in the type of AI we prioritize.
I agree. I saw a quote. That oh, sorry. I was gonna go, but I'll let you go now. I feel bad. Go on, you go, Eden, please.
Okay. That's very kind of you. I'll try and keep it brief. I think sort of, as Errol said, and I think we all agree. I think there's no doubt that the pandemic has and will sort of accelerate digital transformation, and that includes AI in the sort of retail community. I guess for me, I think some of the areas where AI focus and investment will intensify because of the pandemic is around sort of customer care, with all those provisos that we've talked about. And I also think sort of AI in the context of security. The flip side with the surge in e-commerce that we've seen is an increase in sort of fraudulent scams by bad actors, which is very unfortunate. But actually AI can be really effective at improving security. It can be sort of AI to detect anomalies that are indicative of fraud. Plus side, it can be the use of biometrics of various kinds, and actually Lawrence, you touched on this, to improve sort of authentication and verification. I think the use of AI to support more vulnerable groups during the pandemic, and said that example from Telefonica was just brilliant. My God, my mum would so like that. But yes, to support people that are new to online commerce, that are more vulnerable. I think those are some of the sort of lasting benefits, and where AI will become intensified, or activity will become intensified because of the pandemic.
I think some great points in there, Eden. I couldn't agree more, by the way, in terms of the overnight shift that happened last year. It really created two camps, in terms of the businesses we work with, two camps in terms of digital investment, Errol, per your point. So those who had actually made key investments in, some capabilities like chatbots or messaging or, those kinds of, digital customer contact channels, found it much easier to deal with the shift. Suddenly you're closing down your contact center, very hard to take voice calls anymore. Messaging actually really helped a lot of brands because that's easier to take home, right, for people. Taking voice calls home when you've got kids and dogs and everything else happening is very difficult to really do, much less sending the call. So those brands who had invested, chatbots just help with shock absorbing the kind of demand spikes that people were getting, real demand that was very hard to deal with humans anymore. So overnight they were able to retrain chatbots for the new kinds of questions that were happening, right? If I now buy a product from you, am I going to be able to take it back? Can I try it on? What are the rules around that now? Lots and lots of questions that weren't there before. So that almost the taps turned on overnight for that. But Eden, your point around fraud is really important. So I talked about authentication, but a meaningful part of our business is actually doing deep analysis of indicators of fraudulent activity in both voice, using voice biometrics, but also in behavioral terms over digital channels as well. And what we've heard from sort of most of our leading customers is fraud attacks are generally up on the individual 200 to 300% since the start of the pandemic, unfortunately. And a lot of fraudsters out there are exploiting the fact that all of your business processes are changed, so your customers aren't familiar with the new process, and they exploit that, right? So that's what they're looking for. And we're obviously using AI to do things like figure out if it's Errol on the call or if it's Eden on the call, but also we can also do searches against watch lists of known fraudsters and make sure it's not somebody else, right? And treat the calls accordingly, but also scanning for devices and, sort of known anomalies in networks and other things as well. So there's a lot of machine learning behind that technology to help against fraud, which I think is a whole other topic we could discuss for a long time.
Yeah.
So the issue of privacy, when people are calling and doing sentiment analysis based on voice, that sort of thing, is it privacy or concerns of privacy that are the issue? Are companies keeping privacy enough? I mean, is the industry aware enough that they're keeping things private, but the consumer still gets concerned about it? Or is voice, as the slide you used, Seb, with the elderly person being identified, it used to be you use caller ID, and people became fine with that. Are they going to become fine with audio ID, basically, or facial ID, or whatever?
Well, I'd say many of the leading banks in the UK are already using audio ID. That's voice biometrics today, right? So many of the leading bank brands and many around the world are already authenticating users at scale using your voice. And what I would say is, that's opt-in. So users by regulation have to opt into these services. You can't do this to people without them knowing. So that's really important. There's a lot of regulation around that. However, I would say, overwhelmingly, when you offer a user an easier way to solve a problem, that is quite difficult for them. And remembering a password or PIN, something you don't call often or you don't use often, is a problem for us all. I think we all know that. Right, so suddenly you make it easier and say you don't have to remember anything. The opt-in rates tend to be very high. So, there's just a balancing act between them understanding the impact on privacy, but also the upsides to them in terms of reduced friction of the experience, right? So it's just making sure that consumers are fully appraised of, that decision, and it's their decision to make. So, of course, some people would say, no, I reject that, and I'd like to remember my password. But actually, the overwhelming majority would, will choose an easier route usually. So friction is over the consumer quite often.
I think that's a great statement. I think, of course, it's a question if it's legal or not to handle these things. I think everything needs to be legal. But from my point of view, the question is it ethical? And I think that's what we also need to say. We handle data. All companies today are data companies. We have PII data. We have sensitive data. End of the day, we just have to be responsible as companies as well. I think that's why we also have established ethical AI teams within H&M, because we take these things very seriously. We want to respect privacy as much as we can, while following the law, of course. There are some legal obligations. But end of the day, we want to give the power back to the consumer. It's an ethics question. And as you say, opt-in or opt-out, you should always have that possibility. And you should always have the right to be forgotten as well. So important questions and need to be taken seriously.
If I can just add to that, I mean, data privacy it's always it's a fascinating one from the consumer perspective. I think with a lot of the sort of AI solutions out there, and actually even the sort of payment solutions, the way that data is handled, the security around it, it's actually often not too bad. But it doesn't really matter. If consumers think there is an issue, you've got an issue. And I think this is where it becomes imperative that retailers, other brands, telcos, whatever the sector might be, is to really sort of communicate what you do around data privacy in a very tangible way, not in abstracts, not in small prints. And as per GDPR, but go beyond that, really do make attempts to put users in control in a meaningful way.
I think it's especially important, Eden, when we think about personalization and deep personalization, ensuring users see the value to them of you using that data and are explicitly allowing you and preferencing you to do that on their behalf is very different to some of the companies operating, in terms of, big internet players who are using data we know not how as consumers. And obviously a lot of distrust has resulted in that. So I think there's an opportunity for brands to actually use this as a positive brand attribute, right? It's something we just do. We look after you and your data and your identity. So it's certainly something you can take control of.
No, I think so, and that's sort of one of Apple's things, isn't it? I mean, they use their stance on data privacy as a point of differentiation. And the only other thing I was going to say, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but yet another of our survey questions have asked people if their concerns over how a particular player respects and supports data privacy or not. Has that affected how often they use a player's services? It does. Lack of trust, it affects a company's bottom line at the end of the day. So, yeah, massively important. As I said, in the AI context, there are parts of data privacy, Seb, as to your point around personalization, that are going to become a lot more sensitive.
In terms of AI advances in commerce and retail, are there differences globally? You're all global entities, so you all deal with data from around the world. What differences are you seeing by markets? Who's ahead, who's not ahead? Eden, I know you've got data.
I don't know in terms so much by specific markets. I think it depends on the market, mature versus emerging. I think it also varies by sector, by vertical. We focused, obviously on sort of AI in the retail and e-commerce context, and that can cover a lot of different verticals, of course. But there are other sectors, telcos are doing some really cool stuff around sort of how they're leveraging AI at network level and in customer-facing scenarios. A lot of sort of companies that specialize in sort of geolocation intelligence, mapping and navigation, they're doing some pretty advanced stuff. So, sorry, I was sort of slanting that slightly. So it can vary by region. Particularly emerging versus mature, but it also varies by different vertical, and probably within retail it varies quite widely according to the type of commerce player. Actually, one thing that's probably worth stressing that sort of, what I've seen, and I can literally speak to this, locally, we've got a lot of independent, very small retailers where I live that prior to the pandemic had limited or zero online presence. And, they've really changed that. They've sort of pivoted the whole business model. And I know that a lot of them, even though they're quite small companies, are looking at smarter solutions. So that's also something to keep in mind, size of company as well, and, what their traditional business models have been.
Are there differences that you're seeing in H&M properties around the world in terms of commerce?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard. It depends on, and I can just concur with what Eden saying. What we compare and try to look at is other companies. It's, of course, very hard to understand what's going on in other companies as well. So what we try to compare is how much companies publish. That's one way of actually showing how active are they in community. Are they just starting out with AI? Then they probably don't even have a research department. Looking into this like Facebook and Google, they're driving the AI adaptation and cutting edge. Retail is not there yet, but there are many companies that are catching up to that. You see, for instance, Zalando is publishing a few things on ArchiveX, etc. So I wouldn't say from a company or a global player perspective, yes, there will be niche players in each country that might come up with something. But from the global perspective, I don't see any major differences. We try to roll out centrally and make sure the world gets the benefits of the AI we are developing.
Seb?
No, just to add, I mean, I think all companies are in the business of looking after their customers, and we don't see significant difference in digital adoption, right? People's willingness to use these experiences throughout the world. Nobody wants a harder life in one country versus wanting frictionless experiences in another. That's pretty consistent. I think Errol's point in terms of what we do see is the economics can shift. Because things like contact volumes for a given brand might be different in different countries. So, your ability to invest in-house, for example, and build a complete capability in United States, where you've got massive volumes of contact, and then take that to, I don't know, one of the Baltic countries where the contact volumes are extremely low by comparison. It's very hard to invest. So we do see kind of how people procure and develop these solutions differing, right? They tend to use external consultancies to bring solutions into the business versus, things like Errol's doing here, which is, build capabilities and frameworks for organization to do that kind of thing. So that tends to vary a lot more. Customers are customers.
Yeah, I think well said. Okay, we're going to move into Q&A for the audience. We have a lot of questions from the audience. We're going to tackle some of them here. One is, this is really interesting. Which country has an edge in AI business? Where does U.S. stand as compared to China? Anybody want to tackle that one?
I mean, the latest research I saw, at least, was measured in terms of publications. And it's very much driven around so many tech companies as well. I think US and China and Russia are quite ahead on the rest of the world. So that's where I see the domination, at least. I don't know if the rest of the panelists see something different.
I saw an article this week that indicated that we don't really clearly understand how deep AI investment within China actually really goes. I think it was more of a piece that sort of indicates there's a lot more going on in China than we're aware of, and it's already pretty big investment there. I don't have any real data to sort of answer the question more fully.
No, it's tricky. I guess the one other thing perhaps to keep in mind, as you said, the US has got its Googles and its Facebook, but then China has got its Alibabas and its Tencents and its Beidus. And these companies all have incredible AI smarts. They work very closely with the universities. And also, the Chinese government is very proactive and ambitious in backing AI. So just a couple of other things to keep in mind.
Okay. Here's something pretty broad. What do you think about ethics in AI?
It's a must. Broad question, a broad answer, but no, honestly, I think ethics first. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, we have established an ethics team as well. We have AI ethics checklist. We're trying to be in front of the legislation rather than after the legislation. So we're following quite closely the recommendations coming out now from the European Union, and we have frameworks around all of that thing. We want AI to be unbiased and fair to all. So it's extremely important.
Yeah, there's actually go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, God, you almost need a sort of a complete other session to tackle that, because it's massively complex, and you can get into a lot of sort of moral and political sort of discussions around it, which are great, but probably not here and now. But I think one of the things that sort of can make the whole sort of ethics debate extremely difficult is, the way, and it's good in some respects that AI can discover connections that we've not seen before. There is the danger that AI is unexplainable, that it operates in a black box, which in turn raises sort of massive issues for ethics. I think most sort of players in the industry and elsewhere have got their finger on the pulse, are sort of acting responsibly. We've seen examples from H&M, from Errol, but it is a bit of a moving target, which, does make it massively tricky.
And just to add, I don't think I know of any brands that I've come across who wouldn't say that they're an ethical brand or wouldn't want to portray an ethical kind of stance to the market. So I think there's only one answer to that question, really, to be honest. However, as you say, Eden, it's quite complex. So the example I showed earlier on of age detection for a positive use case is discrimination, right? We created an AI that discriminates and used it for a positive gain. So how you use it is also important, right? The use case that you ascribe as well as the models you're creating. It's really quite a complex thing.
Yeah, that as an aside, Visionaires, which is an AIB private invite organization, we just did a roundtable on ethics, and it could have lasted 10 hours long. The issues are so many, and Visionaires has now created an ethics council where AI business leaders are basically addressing this over the next several months. So great points, everyone. It is very complex. Here's another question. Are the U.S. universities and high schools addressing AI sufficiently? I'm guessing no.
I don't know.
Okay, how can here's another. How can third world countries use the achievements of advanced countries in AI?
Wow, that's interesting.
That's very interesting. It depends on third world countries. Do you mean companies in there or the countries themselves? I think most of the research is quite open. I think the bigger question is here, how do we make research more accessible for everyone in the world? By making the research more accessible, that would also open it up for third world countries to actually access it and build on it as well. I think we need to open up for, I mean, there are great universities in third world countries as well, so we need to open up the labor market more and have international corporations to make sure that AI is spread across the world. I think we have started things. I mean, at H&M, we have over 30 nationalities just in the AI team. We speak quite many languages, and we need more of that. We need global companies that build global teams that make sure that we can work from anywhere and with anyone in the world.
Yeah, I agree with everything you've just said, Errol. And I think too, you know, we've mentioned a couple of times that some of these sort of, you know, huge consumer tech companies are also some of the sort of real innovators and pioneers in AI. And I think it's quite incumbent on them to make their development framework sort of accessible and open. And to be fair, a lot of them are. So I think that's something else to keep in mind too. But yeah, I agree on all the points you've mentioned too.
I think that's the key, right? It's democratization word was used earlier on. We're starting to get to a point now where, you know, 20 or so years ago, we could do a lot of the things that we're talking about in terms of, you know, natural language understanding and speech recognition to create a voice bot, for example. That is not new technology, but it used to cost a few £1 million for a brand to implement that kind of a solution just to get going, right? And that's completely changed. So, you know, access to tools and capabilities that mean you don't need PhDs and an army of them necessarily to create this kind of solution means it's much easier for people to scale this to markets that couldn't have touched these solutions in the past. So that has definitely improved. As I said earlier, though, I think that the training and expertise and experience to design, build and optimize these kinds of solutions is a little way behind still. So that's a lot more of an education kind of challenge, I think, as well as a technology one.
Yeah.
Okay, another audience question. I think this one's for you, Seb. By the way, make sure everyone who's viewing here does the survey that's on the console here. Here's the question. How far away are we from having a universal virtual assistant which is able to move from your account's devices actively based on your use? For example, using AI to be able to assist you with your preferences, much like a human interaction.
So we're talking about general intelligence kind of question there in my mind, right? So a universal assistant says to me, every domain can answer a question on any topic. And the blunt answer is a long way away from that. So most conversational systems are designed to specific set of domains and optimized to that. It means they solve immense problems in those domains. But if you start asking questions that deviate from that, you tend to go unstuck. So, you know, for example, if you take the kinds of devices Eden was talking about earlier on, They might be able to answer general knowledge questions, but without appropriate skills plugged into them or actions plugged into them, they have no idea how to answer a business question about a brand, right? So there's a lot of work to create that. And if you think about how many different subjects there might be in your life for a general assistant to operate with, it's a lot. So I think there's no such thing as a general assistant at this point, or general intelligence. It's very specific.
Probably just after
the
autonomous car.
I can recommend a book on the topic if the author wants to read something more. Mark, Life 3.0, if you want to understand more on general intelligence and when we will achieve it. There's some really good predictions in that book.
Sounds good.
Eden, Errol, and Sebastian, thank you so much for all of your insights. Great stuff. Great job. Great presentations. Great content. Thank you all so much. And thank you all for viewing and listening. And I'm Chuck Martin, and we are signing off. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.